American English, American English, American English webinar series. Teach and learn. American English webinar series.
Welcome everyone to the second webinar in American English Webinar Series 7, brought to you by the American English team at the U.S. Department of State in Washington, D.C. Let's begin with a look at this great photo submitted by the American Center in Male, featuring teachers from the Maldives participating in AE Webinar 7.1. Thank you to everyone who sent in photos after American English Webinar 7.1, and please do share any photos from today's webinar groups by emailing them to americanenglishwebinars@elprograms.org. We may feature them in our next webinar. I'm Lauren, part of the American English Webinar team, also known as Moderator Lauren, and you'll also see Moderator Heather in the chat box here to help you during the webinar. We'll be here to assist you as you participate during the webinar series. Here you can find the Series 7 schedule. We have great topics lined up for you on grammar, media literacy, and teaching business English. Our next session in 2 weeks on October 4th will focus on empowering your students with media literacy with Joe McVeigh. The way for you to participate is by typing in the chat box, as many of you are already doing. The chat box is where you can ask questions or make comments related to today's topic. We may not be able to answer every question during this session, as there are often hundreds of teachers participating. However, there is another place to ask questions after the session is over, the NEEN Community for Teachers, which we'll look at in more detail momentarily. The presenter will also ask you poll questions. These are multiple choice and multiple answer questions, which will appear on the screen for you to answer. Unfortunately, some may experience technical problems during the webinar. We will let you know if we are having a global problem. If you do lose sound, you can follow along with the captions pod at the bottom of the screen if refreshing your browser doesn't correct the problem. Each webinar series consists of 6 webinars. During the series, webinars take place every other Wednesday. Participants who attend at least 4 out of 6 webinars receive an e-certificate from the Regional English Language Office or local U.S. Embassy after the series ends. To ensure that you are eligible for the e-certificate, we will ask you to submit your attendance at the very end of the webinar. At the end of the webinar, you will click on the internet link we provide you that you can submit the requested attendance information. We hope many of you are already NEEN community members, but if you haven't registered yet, please do join us. It may take up to 72 hours for your NEEN registration to be approved, especially at the beginning of a new series. Here you can find resources and discussion questions related to each webinar, as well as all of the webinar recordings and featured materials. The NEEN is also where you can ask presenter questions after the webinar and live chat with your fellow community members. And before I introduce our webinar for today, I'd also like to announce that American English is launching its first MOOC, or Massive Open Online Course, for English language teachers. This month, our webinars are related to the theme for the American English eTeacher MOOC, Teaching Grammar Communicatively, which begins on September 25th. If you like what you learned during our first session and today, you may be interested in learning more by participating in this free online course, sponsored by the U.S. Department of State and designed by World Learning. To register for free, follow the link listed in the comment section, www.aeeteacher.org. And now for today's webinar, to correct or not correct. Ideas for subtle correction during speaking tasks. This webinar will present techniques designed to correct students' grammar without interrupting the free flow of speech, provide an opportunity for participants to consider how these techniques might work in their classrooms, and explore practical activities for using these techniques in the English language classroom. It is my pleasure to introduce today's presenter, Elizabeth Hepford. Elizabeth Hepford recently completed her doctorate in applied linguistics at Temple University in Philadelphia. Previously, she served as a U.S. Department of State English Language Fellow in Albania, a Peace Corps volunteer in Russia, and an ESL instructor in Mexico and the United States. Her research and teaching focus on developing oral fluency, grammatical complexity, and general accuracy. Welcome, Elizabeth.
Thank you for the introduction, Lauren. I'd like to welcome you all to American English Webinar 7.2, to correct or not correct, ideas for subtle correction during speaking tasks. My name is Elizabeth, and I'm excited that you're joining me today to talk about grammar and speaking. I'd like to start by explaining what I mean by subtle grammar correction. By subtle, I mean that the correction is quick and that it doesn't interrupt the conversation. In fact, it can be part of the conversation. That way, our students can keep talking while we are helping them to improve their grammar. So first, I'd like to look at your answers to the pre-webinar questions and talk about them a little bit. So our first question was, what activities do you do in your classes to practice speaking? And it looks like a lot of you use group discussions, which is great because it gives the students an opportunity not just to talk to the teacher, but to talk to each other. Many of you are using formal presentations and debates and games, and I was happy to see that there's a variety of options that you're using in your classes because it offers more opportunities for your students to speak. So our second question was, if you correct your students' grammar while they're speaking, when and how do you correct it? Most of you said you wait until they're finished. And today we're going to talk about ways that you can offer them a little correction while they are speaking. And that way they have the correction when they make the mistake, and they're more likely to remember. And last, I asked you, why do you think students struggle to speak freely? And most of you thought that this was due to practice. So today we're going to look at some ways to increase the time in your classes that the students can practice. But I want to start with the importance of speaking practice. And as many of us know, students who do extremely well on grammar exams do not necessarily do well on speaking tasks. And that's because they need to practice. Being able to write and do grammar exercises did not necessarily mean you can speak. So another thing to remember is that the TOEFL and the IELTS exam require speaking, and we want our students to do well on these exams. So it's important that they have a chance to practice speaking. And of course, if our students go to another country where people speak English, that we want them to be able to speak. But this creates a problem for us as teachers. If we correct their grammar during the flow of speech, it interrupts that thought process, and they may be scared to talk to you after that. But if we let them repeat mistakes, then it creates bad habits, and they won't learn to correct their mistakes. So I'm curious what you have done and what has been your experience. So in the chat box, if you could tell me what happens when we correct students while they're speaking. What has been your experience with this? Do your students struggle? Do they stop talking? What have we seen happening? Okay. I see some say they're expecting to be corrected, and that would vary from classroom to classroom. Okay, some say you stop talking. They feel embarrassed. Okay, well, we're going to talk about some of these issues today. And some say they feel shy or even get mad. Well, some of the things that I will offer you today may help you solve some of these issues with your students and make them more comfortable while they're speaking. So let's look at our topics for today. There are three things we're going to talk about. The first is written grammar versus spoken grammar. The next is techniques for correcting spoken grammar errors and mistakes. And then I will give you some practical application of correction techniques. I'll show you some ways you can use these in your classrooms. So I'd like to start by talking about the differences between written grammar and spoken grammar. But before we do that, let's go to the polls, and I have a quick question for you there too. When you're using oral activities in your class, how often do you do that? So do you use them hardly ever, at least once a month, once a week? Okay. So it looks like a lot of you are using oral activities fairly often, some in every class. Okay, that's great. Okay, so let's go back to the presentation and take a look at written grammar versus spoken grammar. Okay, so written grammar allows us to stop and think before we write. So sometimes the student, before the pen actually touches the paper, they've thought about it, and we're not really seeing their first draft. They also could correct it before the teacher sees it, maybe erase the answer or adding something with their pen later. So written grammar also does not allow questions from the reader or require answers from the writer. So written grammar in general is one-way communication with lots of time to think. On the other hand, spoken grammar requires instant speech, so our students do not have time to think before they speak. It requires interaction between the speakers, and not just interaction, but appropriate interaction. So it needs to be the right volume. Should we be yelling or whispering? It needs to be body language that makes sense, a certain level of formality or casualness, and even the facial expression needs to match what we're saying. And that's a lot to think about when we're speaking. So spoken grammar requires two-way communication, and that includes two people, so there's more to think about and more to do. So we're going to look at some specific features of spoken grammar, 4 things in particular. And these I'm taking from an article that I put in the resources for you if you'd like to read it. And it's called Spoken Grammar, Two-Way Communication. The first of these is an ellipsis. And this is when we omit part of the sentence. And the next is a filler. And these are pauses or words or silence. The next is a head, where we move the word to the beginning of the sentence to emphasize it. And then there's a tail, where we move the words to the end of the sentence to specify it. So let's go through each of those. The first one are ellipses. And ellipses are specific details are omitted from the sentence. So for example, in our first sentence, it says, he left to go there. Well, who is he and where did he go? The non-ellipsis version would include these details. So we have John's brother left to go to the store. Our next is a question. Any questions? The full sentence is, do you have any questions? And the answer to that question might be just yes, where the non-ellipsis version would be yes, I have a question. The last example deletes some information that's not important when we're speaking. So the person says, the box was made in Italy. And the non-ellipsis version is, the box on the table was made in Italy. So I'm just curious, can you show me with a raise of hands, have any of you taught about ellipses in your class? So if you've done that, use the raised hand tool. And then I see some hands. Good, good. Okay, if you can, unraise your hand after you've raised it, because we're going to be using that tool again, and that way I'll know whether you're answering that same question. All right, our next feature is a filler. And fillers are words or sounds or silence in speech when the person is thinking. So for example, our first sentence. So speaking can be hard, like when I'm nervous. And here we have 3 fillers. We have so, and like. And our other example, we have so when I'm nervous, it's really hard. And here we have fillers that are actual sounds, and then we also have silence. And in these times, people are usually thinking. So again, I'm going to ask you to tell me in the chat box if you have talked about fillers in your classes, and maybe give me some ideas of what you've talked about with your students. How do you approach this topic? I see someone making a comment about American TV has lots of fillers in it. Okay, so I'll let you think about that for a second. And I see we're getting pragmatics. Good. And some of you are talking about that you don't mention it too much. Okay, so let's look at our last few features. We have heads and tails. And here we're placing a word or phrase for emphasis. So for heads, we move the important word to the beginning of the sentence. An example could be grammar. It can be confusing for learners. So grammar was put first to make it important. Then we also have the game. It was amazing. Okay, again, it's at the front for emphasis. Then we can also do the same with tails by moving the words to the end of the sentence. Okay, so our first example is, it's so confusing for learners. Grammar, that is. Our last example is, it was an amazing game, wasn't it? Now, I think some of you might have taught this in your classes because it's also called a tag question, and I've seen it in a lot of textbooks. Let's try a poll quiz on these, just to make sure everyone has the concept. I'm going to give you some examples, and you can tell me which one you think it is. So here's our first. There's a lot to do, isn't there? So this is an ellipsis, a filler, a head, or a tail. Okay. Looks like most of you have it. It is a tail. So let's try the next one. Any problems? What do you think of this one? Yes, this one is an ellipsis, and it looks like most of you are getting it. Good. Our next one is, it's like a tiger. Okay, and all of you have gotten this one. It's a filler. Excellent. And our last one, the baby. It's so cute. What is this one? Head. Very good. Okay, so we have heads. All right, so let's go back to the presentation. And the next thing I want to talk about is what happens when your students are nervous or scared. And it's our job to help ease that fear of speaking and make the students feel a little bit better about it. So do any of you have suggestions for the group? How would you handle your students being scared? What would you do to help them and make them feel better so that they can speak? Do we have any ideas? I see a few. Okay, speaking is not easy for any student. That's very, very true. And a calm classroom, I like that idea. Self-volunteering, okay. And I'm seeing, try to cheer them up. I like that. Tell a joke and smile. There's a lot you can do that will make you feel a little bit better, okay? All right, so let me give you a suggestion that goes with this presentation. We can use authentic text, and authentic text will show students the way people really speak. And we use a lot of movies and speeches in our classroom, which is great because it gives them good pronunciation, and generally they're how people speak, but not exactly how they speak. The difference is that many times these movies and speeches are professional speakers, and they're professional speakers who have memorized a script. So it's not exactly how people speak. So a better idea for showing how people speak with spoken grammar features is to look at recorded speech. Go out and find some people who speak English as their first language and record a conversation of them. So that recorded conversation will include those spoken grammar features. It's natural and it's unscripted. Now, some people may not have access to native speakers that they can ask to make a recording for them. So in those cases, you might try some unscripted media, and you can use talk shows or interviews, and those provide unscripted media because the person does not know what the question will be. So to give you a better idea of this, I'm going to play a...
This one gives a whole lot of food, so you end up with a lot of food, not quite as good. But, you know, it was okay considering what we were doing.
Yeah. Mine was pretty good, but it was a little too rich for me.
Too rich?
Yeah. The sauce was really thick. I would have liked it to be a little thinner.
Okay, so that was the unscripted version, and you heard maybe some fillers or things like that. Let's listen to the scripted version of this conversation.
This one gave a lot of food. It's not quite as good, but it's okay considering what we were doing.
Mine was pretty good. It was a little too rich for me.
Too rich?
The sauce was really thick. I would have liked it better if it were a little thinner.
Okay, so let's see the poll question and see what you think you heard. Or you can answer that in the chat box. Here we go. Oh, people weren't able to hear. Is it working now? Okay, I'm going to show it to you, so don't worry. I hear some people commenting on the tone, no forced starts, no pauses. The scripted was faster, that's true. Okay, so you're seeing a lot of differences. So let's go back to the presentation and I'll show you the script written out so you can see what type of spoken grammar features were there. Okay, so here we have it. Oops. There. Okay. So the ones marked in red are fillers. And then we also have a few ellipses that are in blue. So we have a sentence that goes, you end up with a lot of food not quite as good. So here the speakers combine two sentences. It should be, it's not quite as good. And then we have fillers, you know, it's, things like that. And then the second to last is just a question, too rich? And the full sentence would have been, is it too rich? So you get the idea of what these differences are. Okay, so why did we use fillers in speech? Let's focus on fillers for just a minute. So in the chat box, can you let me know why people use fillers? What do we do? Why do we say or so? So I'm seeing some answers. To continue a conversation, good. To think, yes. Okay, to gain time, all of these are really good answers. In fact, most of them are the one I'm going to focus on, which is about the speaker's thinking. And we do this not just when we're speaking in our second language, but also in our first language. So it's when the speaker is thinking. They might be searching for a word or an idea. They might be searching for the correct grammar, or they might be translating a sentence from their first language. So let's talk about when we should help our students and when we should correct them. And I want to focus on the difference between an error and a mistake. So first we have errors, and errors result from a lack of knowledge. And this happens when students don't know the rule. Then we have mistakes, and mistakes result from various factors, usually related to time to think. So our students are more likely to make mistakes during speech than during writing, and that's because they don't have as much time to think. And when we're trying to think about how to correct them, we need to decide, is it an error or is it a mistake? So do any of you have examples of when your students have made mistakes? They knew the rule, but they made a mistake. So Have you had this happen in your classes? And what do you do? I see people saying fossilization, which is the term for it in applied linguistics, so that's nice. Okay. They're speaking too fast, they make mistakes, and they aren't careful. So all of these are true. Okay. Let's go to the poll question, and we're going to see what you think on this one. I'm going to give you some examples, and tell me when you think you would correct. Okay, so would you correct a grammar error during a conversation outside of class? Maybe when a student is answering a question in class, or a grammar error overheard during a discussion? How about during a presentation? Or it depends on different factors. So we're getting answers in. Looks like a lot of you would correct during a question in class, and a lot of you would say it depends on different factors. So let's go back to the presentation, and I want to talk about what it depends on because I'm curious what you will say. So in the chat box, tell me what kind of factors that might depend on. What are you talking about there? So I'm seeing some of you are writing about grammar tenses. Okay. What else? What factors? Interlanguage, syntax, class environment, good. The structure you're covering, that makes a very large difference. Okay, the student's personality, the focus of the lesson, excellent. Okay, these are all important factors. All right, so next we're going to talk about when to correct and when not to correct. And then we'll talk about how to do those different tools. So let's take a look at when there's no need to correct. Now, as I mentioned, mistakes can be caused by thinking time. And when they're making a mistake rather than error, they just need more practice. So there's not really a need to correct that. And if a student corrects themselves, then they don't need a correction either because they already knew how to do the correction. But these problems do indicate where your student is struggling, and you might want to focus on those areas in the next lesson. Some other places where you don't need to correct are situations that will embarrass the student. If you feel the correction is needed, you can talk to them after class or after their presentation. Just make a note. So formal class presentations, not a good time to correct. Extremely shy students, you need to be careful making corrections with students that are shy because they will quit speaking, and we want them to practice. That's the only way they will get better. Now the last one is when a student is clearly struggling and you want them to actually try to correct themselves first. If they can't correct themselves, then you do want to help them. Or if a student asks for help, then go ahead and offer them a correction because they need it. So let's go on and look at when to correct students. So the first example I would say is if it's grammar you're working on in class. So for example, you've been just reviewing the difference between in and on. So your students make that mistake, you can correct it quickly because they just learned the rule and it will help reinforce it. You should correct mistakes that create misunderstandings because of course we want our students to be understood and that will help them. And if the student asks for help. Now sometimes I hear teachers say, well, I don't want to correct every single mistake because the student won't have a chance to talk. And keep in mind, you won't hear every mistake because when we're listening for the meaning of the sentence. And the grammar that gets in the way of the meaning are the ones that we really want to correct. So let's try another poll question. And I want to know which one of these you would correct. So our options are a mistake during a presentation, a grammatical mistake made during class practice, excessive pauses and fillers, and a mistake that creates misunderstanding. So it looks like most of you are commenting on a mistake that creates misunderstanding, which is good. And some of you are saying a mistake during class practice, which I would also expect, particularly if you have just finished talking about it. Now, the excessive pauses and fillers, keep in mind that that really means the student needs more time to practice and not necessarily a correction. So let's go back to the presentation, do one more quick review, and then we'll start talking a little bit more about how to do those corrections. So to quickly review, you want to correct when the forms are being practiced, the forms that you're doing in class, mistakes that create misunderstandings, and if a student asks. But you don't necessarily want to correct if you have fillers, pauses, repairs, and self-corrections, because those need practice. You don't want to correct in situations that might lead to embarrassment, or formal class presentations, which would also lead to embarrassment, or when the student is still trying. Go ahead and let them keep trying. So let's go on. And I want to talk about one of the issues with students noticing. Now, if your student doesn't know they're making a mistake, they'll keep making that mistake. And a lot of times, grammar stops improving if the students don't know they're making a mistake. And this might happen when the learners are able to communicate their needs. So this happens often when someone moves to another country and they learn the language, but they don't learn everything. But they can still go shopping, they can talk to their friends, they can do everything they want to do. So they quit trying, and nobody corrects them because they can be understood. And that can also happen when no one corrects them. So there's no longer a correction of the mistakes or the errors, and the student doesn't realize they're making a mistake. It could also happen with a lack of consistent practice, or when the study slows because they're no longer looking at grammar like they used to. So let's take a look at some techniques we can do that would not interrupt the student speaking. So I'm going to take you through 3 different ideas. The first one is recasting. And I noticed in the discussion poll beforehand, a lot of you were calling this echoing, and it seems to be basically the same thing. It's just saying the sentence correctly after the student made the mistake. Next, we have clarifying questions, which are questions that try to get the student to correct themselves. And last, we have negotiated meaning, and this is where the students are talked through questions in order to get them to a point they can make corrections. So by a raise of hands, how many of you have done this? How many of you have done any of these? Recasting, I'm seeing lots of hands. Great, great. Okay, so let's go through each of the techniques and talk about them. So first we have recasting, and this one is the most subtle. And the purpose of this is just to let your students notice they made the mistake. They don't necessarily have to correct it. So you restate what the student said, but with the correction. So here's an example. What were the question? The student says, the teacher answers, what was the question? Can anyone tell us what the question was? Now we've modeled the correction twice. So the whole class has heard the correction. And the student might say it quietly to themselves, but they don't need to necessarily repeat it. Recasting works really well during a whole class discussion. And that's because you can quickly do the recast and move to the next student, so it doesn't disrupt the flow of the class or the conversation. It also works well during conversations between a teacher and a student, or between a student and a student that the teacher hears the mistake, because again, it's quick, and that way the conversation can continue. So our second method is clarifying questions, and there are 2 types of these. The first is to ask a genuine question. So a student says, he will come tonight, and the teacher knows that the student actually meant she. So the teacher says, who? And the student thinks and goes, she will come tonight. So they've made their own correction. The second type is to pretend you didn't hear, and you're basically giving the student a second chance. So the student says, yesterday I go to the park, and the teacher says, pardon? And the student answers, yesterday I went to the park. So in this case, they were able to correct themselves. So let's, by show of hands, look at this again. How many people have done this? You can also type into the chat box if you'd rather. Do we have people who do these in their class? I see some people do. Okay, good. So let's take a look at when and how to use these. Now, clarifying questions are great because they encourage the students to self-correct. And if they correct, they'll remember it better. But an advantage for us as teachers is we know the difference. We know if the student made an error, which they cannot fix, or if they made a mistake, which means that it can actually be corrected. Okay, so these work best when, clarifying questions work best when a question can be asked. So it's a mistake where you can say who or what and get them to repeat it correctly. Another time they work really well is if it's a form that you have been working on. So the best time to use these are during whole class discussions and one-on-one conversations, because they take a little bit more time, so you don't want to use them in situations that's going to draw a lot of attention to the student. So don't use when the students are talking to each other, and that's because they will quit talking, and we want them to keep talking. And don't use during formal presentations, because you're going to stop the presentation, and that will make the student more nervous. So let's take a look at our last, which is negotiating meaning. And this is the least subtle, and it does take a little more time. So the teacher and the student discuss the meaning for clarity. So here's an example. The student says, "Yesterday I goes to the mall." And the teacher answers, "The teacher wasn't really sure." So they say, "Did you go or someone else?" Because that could be he, she, it, or a mistake with I. The student says, "I did." So the teacher says, "Do you mean I went?" The student says, "Yes." "Could you repeat your answer?" And now the student gives the correction. "Yesterday I went to the mall." And what happened at the mall? So we can keep the conversation going. Okay. So by a raise of hands or in the chat box, how many of you have done this? Have you used this technique in your classes? I'm seeing some hands go up, so that's good. All right, so let's talk about when to use this. So this works best in activities that involve either a one-on-one conversation or in small groups of 2 or 3 people, or if you're a private tutor, this is a good technique to use. Don't use this during a whole class discussion because it takes too long and it will interrupt the class. Or you also don't want to use it anywhere that you might embarrass your student. So let's kind of look at all of these techniques and the benefits of them. So the benefits of these techniques include that, first of all, the students are encouraged to correct themselves, and it promotes their awareness and then they know they're making a mistake. It also maintains the flow of the conversation, so we're still talking. It shows that you are listening, and it shows that the mistakes are noticeable. Sometimes students think, well, no one ever mentioned that mistake, so maybe it's not a mistake. This way you know, okay, and your students know. All right, so let's go to a poll, and I'm going to show you a couple examples of student speech, and I'm going to have you tell me which of these techniques you might try to use. So our first example is like this. The student says, "Yes, I think the author said that he ran away because his parents were mean." Okay. I see a lot of you choosing recast, which really would be a good choice for this. Okay. Let's take a look at the next one, and then I'll give you some ideas on what I would have done. So here's our next one. And the student says, "I don't like that book. It was difficult." Okay, so we have recast again, popular choice. And some of you are also saying a clarifying question. Okay, so let's go look at some examples again. Let's go back to the presentation, and I'll show you what I might have done in these situations. And there's more than one option for all of these. You can choose to do a way that works for you once you've experimented and decided what you like. So here's our sentence. You could offer a recast and just repeat, "The author was saying that he ran away." Okay. You could also do a clarifying question where you just pretend you didn't hear it. Could you repeat that? And the student can try again. Next, we have clarifying question. What was the author saying? And the student hopefully would reply, "The author was saying that he ran away because his parents were mean." This one, negotiating meaning, might be difficult to use because the meaning is really pretty clear. We know what the student meant. So let's take a look at a couple things to notice about this. First, the student improved after they thought about it, and you can see that because they stopped using fillers. And when can you correct the sentence? This sentence, the student didn't pause in the sentence, so you would have to wait until the end. Okay, so let's take a look at example 2. And I chose this example because I wanted you to see that this works well for pronunciation too. So you could easily make this correction by just saying difficult at the end, but there's another error. So you could correct this during the pause, or you could wait until the end of the sentence. Either one could work if you do it quickly. But I want to show you an example of negotiated meaning. So our student says, I know like that book. It was difficult. And the teacher wants to lead the student to the right answer. So they say, did you like the book? And the student says no. So we offer a recast. So you didn't like it. Was it difficult? We've modeled how to say difficult. Yes. Try saying that as a sentence now. And the student answers, I didn't like the book. Good. Why didn't you like it? It was difficult. Good. So the student has had a chance to hear it, and they've had a chance to produce it. And that is the way negotiated meaning should work. Now, one problem we have with students is lots of times they just give you a yes or no answer. And when they do that, you can ask them to repeat it, or you could also just do a recast, and that way you can move on. All right. So last thing I want to do today is give you an example of an activity and how this would work within that activity. So one of the resources I gave you was an article called Reading to Speak, Integrating Oral Communication Skills. And that's in the resources. They gave 3 ideas. The first was to reenact the reading, so do like a play. Okay. The second is to debate a topic, and that's what we're going to do today. And the last is to read to interview. And this is where the student reads something and then they interview each other. So for a topic, I chose debate on school uniforms. And I decided to do this one because many levels of students could do this. It could be lower level or higher level. Now, the steps that you could do to get through this debate would be as follows. First, pre-plan. Then read and discuss with classmates, have the debate, and then discuss the debate. So I'm going to give you a poll question. So let's go to that. And I want to know where you think the most correction should happen. In the pre-planning, during the reading and discussion, during the debate, or during the post-debate. Okay, most of you are saying the post-debate, and that makes sense because by then the student should have the vocabulary, and that way they could concentrate on the grammar. But the techniques I'm going to go through today can actually work in any of the steps, and I'm going to show you how that might work. So let's go back to the presentation, and we can take a look at the different steps and how this might work. So first we have pre-planning. And in pre-planning, you want to introduce the topic, and that way you find out what your students already know, and you find out if they have any strong opinions about it. Next, you can write vocabulary that they might need on the board. And for this particular task, they might need school policies or peer pressure or freedom of expression. Okay, and you can adjust those for the level. Next, you might want to predict the grammar issues that they might have. So for this activity, I'm going to guess that they might have problems with the auxiliary do, or they might have problems with the conditional tenses, because debate leads to a lot of if I could, I would kind of sentences. So here's how that might look in the classroom, or what you might hear. So the teacher asks them, who thinks we should wear school uniforms? Do you like your uniform or not? And in this case, the students have their own uniforms. Student 1 says, I don't like my uniform. And the teacher says, I don't like my uniform. What about you, student 2? So we've done a recast. And student 2 has heard the correction, and student 2 says, I don't like it. So they got it right. Teacher says, good. Why do we have uniforms? And student 3 says, my mom likes them to ready. Teacher doesn't really understand what the student said, so she says, why does she like them? And the student answers, to ready in the morning. Now the teacher understands, so she offers a recast. To get ready in the morning. And the student 3 says, yes, to get ready in the morning. Good, who else? So we keep the conversation moving. Next, we're going to read the articles and discuss them. And to do this, you want to break your students into two groups, one who is for the uniforms and one who is against. And you want to assign the students because otherwise you will end up with 18 students that do not want the uniforms and 2 who do. And you can't do a debate like that. So assign it to them. Then each group reads an article related to the position and they break into pairs, one from each group, and they explain the article to each other. So this activity would take place while the students are talking to each other and the teacher is walking around the room listening. So the teacher hears the students and one says, schools with uniforms are safer. And student 2 says, that's not true. Student 1 says, the article says bad people are easier to saw. So the teacher heard this and offers a recast. Easier to see. Go on. Student 2 says, no, they aren't. Bad people will be saw because teachers do know them. The teacher again offers a recast. Bad people would be seen because teachers do not know them. Good, keep going, and walks to the next group so the conversation can continue. Next, we have our debate. And we want the students to sit in their assigned groups, and if you can, move the desks so that they face each other, so it's more like a conversation. So each student should take a turn, and the teacher moderates. And that way the teacher has an opportunity to offer some corrections. And that might look like this. Okay. So student 1 says, school uniforms would limit our freedom. Teacher offers a recast. School uniforms would limit our freedom. Team 2, what do you think about that? So we're keeping the conversation moving. Student 2 says, but school uniforms do us safe. And the teacher goes, pardon? I didn't hear you. Student goes, school uniforms make us safe? Yes, very good. Very good point. And how do they make us safe? Someone else in your group? So we're calling on more students. Student 3 says, we know who belong at school. And the teacher offers a recast. We know who belongs at school. Very good. Back to team 1. How would uniforms limit your freedom? So again, we're keeping the conversation moving. Afterwards, you can have a discussion about the topic, but you can also have a discussion about the process. So we'll begin by having the class vote, and we know how many students think of what students think of the debate. Then you can ask questions about the debate. So how did you feel about arguing against your opinion? Because many of them will be. Did anyone change their opinion? Why? Most of you think that school uniforms are good. Why? Okay. Call on the students to increase the participation and try to keep the conversation calm. Sometimes students will get emotional during a debate, but if you keep the conversation calm by telling them just to remain calm. So here's what that might look like. This would be that discussion. Did anyone change their opinion? And student 1 says, I never thought about how made schools safest. So we have 2 mistakes. The teacher corrects the first one. What made schools safer? So we have a model. And the student says uniforms. Oh, okay. Try saying that again. Student 1 says, I never thought about how uniforms made schools safest. So we fixed 1 mistake. Now the teacher offers a recast. I never thought about how uniforms made schools safer. And student 1 understands safer. Oh, okay. So now we've corrected both mistakes. Now here I have an unscripted text that I'd just like you to look at and see the mistakes. And in the chat box, can you offer me which mistakes you would correct? And just let me know. So let's see. The mistakes we have boy is a dog. We have a mistake here. We have a mistake here. One here. This one has none. One here. One here. And this is unclear. Okay, how would you correct them? I see you're offering what the correction is, but would you use a recast or a clarification question? What would you do to correct this mistake? Any ideas? Okay, now I'm seeing recast, clarification, recast. Okay, good, good. All right, I'm going to give you an example of what I would do in this particular case. So here we have it. So here we have the boy is the dog. So I have this mistake and this mistake. Okay. Now I focused on the second one because I figured they wouldn't remember the first one. So I just did a recast. The boy brings a bucket. And the student says, maybe he liked the lake. Same mistake. So we're just going to do a recast again. He likes the lake. Keep going. And now the student says, and he found a frog in the pond in the lake. Now these could be considered mistakes, but they are just spoken grammar. So we want to just encourage them to practice more. Okay. So here we have this teacher just said good. Next, we have the sentence he wants. It should be once. We've already made that correction twice. So then we have a mistake that really makes it hard to understand what the student is doing. Okay. So what would you do in this case? Does anyone have suggestions? How would you handle he hooked the river? He hooked the river, because it's not necessarily a grammar mistake. What could you do? Anyone have an idea? Okay, I'm seeing clarifying questions. Good, good. Okay, you could try pardon. Could you repeat that, please? Try negotiating. There's some different ways you can handle this. Okay, good, good. So we've got lots of different options. All right. So here's some spoken grammar features from this particular speech sample. And we have then we have he found, which could be some problems too. Okay. And we have he went to catch the frog too. Okay, so we have pauses. All of these are spoken grammar features. And what this means is that this particular student needs more time to practice speaking. And the other mistakes you could correct, and they will improve with the spoken grammar features as time goes by. So let's do a quick summary of what the different features are. So first, you could do a recast. And a recast, you simply repeat what your student said with the correct form. We can also do clarifying questions, where we ask a student a question that makes them notice the mistake. Or we could do a question where we pretend we didn't hear the response and ask them to repeat it. And lastly, we can ask the student clarifying questions and arrive at a corrected sentence. Okay. So, do you have any questions about these techniques that I can address? I'm going to look real quick and see if I see anything. Recast is the best one, I think. Which is the best one? Which is the best one really depends on the situation. So as I mentioned, recasts work well when you're going to do something quickly. A clarifying question is a situation where you can encourage the student to correct themselves. And negotiating meaning works best when you can try to get to making the student make the correction by using clarifying questions or recasts. Okay. So I see another question, which one is the best one? Which is the best one for beginners? Beginners might benefit the most from recasts, and a lot of them, because they're going to hear the correction. The clarifying questions or the negotiated meaning might be too hard for them unless you can make the question simple. Clarifying questions where you ask who or what or ask them to repeat it might work just as well for beginners. It's really going to depend some on your style and how your students react with you. I have another one. While the student was telling the story, isn't it incorrect to correct him between? I should have explained that a little better. Let me put that one back so you can see. Between each of those where I have S1 again, they paused. They were actually turning the page, and I didn't explain that. So there was a chance to correct them because they were turning the page. Okay. Other questions? Someone mentions that Recast is the one most used, and I would agree. It's the one used most often, and it is probably the easiest one. Can we use it with ESL learners? Definitely. You can use this with all levels of ESL learners. So we have, what if the student just answers yeah? That teacher, we should put them into a repeat. It depends. You could do a recast to just let them hear the correction, or you could ask them, could you say that? Could you make a sentence? And that way they would have a little more practice. Others, let's see. Can we use this with young learners? Definitely. You can use recasts work well with young learners. The negotiated meaning might be a little more difficult. Okay, I have another question. If we get reaction from students, please do not correct the mistakes. What can we do? Okay, if they ask you not to correct them, then wait until they're finished. Take some notes and then discuss it with them. You might even offer to repeat the task with them and have them do it again and see if they make the same mistakes, and then maybe do a few quick recasts so that the students can hear the correction. But if they ask you, try to respect them, okay? And what to do with the shy student. If a student is extremely shy, then try to encourage them after every single correction you make and tell them, good, keep going, and maybe not correct them quite as often. Take some notes, let them finish, or things like that. Okay. Do we have time for more questions? Okay, let's see what else we have. Can we neglect error or mistake? The error or mistake has to do with what the student is doing. If it's a mistake, they should be able to correct it. So you can offer them the opportunity to correct it. If it's an error, they will keep making that same mistake because they don't know the rule. So if your student is making an error, you can try to teach that in the next class rather than trying to correct it right then. If it's a mistake, you can correct it quickly, and that way they'll remember. I think I have time for one more. Do we have similar techniques to correct writing grammar? One thing you might try to do with writing is, rather than giving the student the correction, you can underline it or circle it and give it back and let them try to fix it themselves. This again will give them the opportunity to self-correct, and it will also give you an opportunity to see if the student can correct it. If they can't correct it, then you know you need help. So I think that's all we have time for. So lastly, I'd just like to end with a few last thoughts. If you expect your students to struggle, because they will when you're working on speaking, they're going to need time to practice. So when they're needing practice, expect some slow speech, pauses, and fillers. And just like you can't teach basketball without letting students play, you can't teach English without letting students speak. So try to give them time to speak. Lastly, thank you all for being here, and I
Thank you, Elizabeth, for sharing those ideas for correction during speaking practice, along with demonstrating some practical ideas for creating an engaging speaking activity that allows for subtle corrections. It's always great to take part in a webinar that is full of ideas that teachers can try out immediately in their classrooms. And we'd also like to thank you, our audience, for your active participation and thoughtful comments today. We hope to see you again in 2 weeks for American English Webinar 7.3, where we will discuss ideas for empowering students with media literacy with Joe McVeigh. Be sure to register with your RELO or local U.S. Embassy if you are interested. Information about registering will be available on the name. Also, please don't forget to register today for American English e-teacher course, which begins very soon on September 25th. If you like what you learned during our first session and today, you may be interested in learning more by participating in this free online course sponsored by the U.S. Department of State and designed by World Learning. To register for free, follow the link listed in the comments section, www.aeeteacher.org.